A session of the summit, where we're going to get an insider view of the new airport terminal opening in 2020 from Skyport. Then we'll be meeting Airline Pacific, or APAC, to share with us the components of an air service development plan, some of their findings specific to Bermuda that they've come across so far, and how we can build a sustainable strategy for air service development moving forward. And then finally, we'll do a panel discussion with representatives from both of those, Skyport and APAC, as well as the Bermuda Airport Authority and the Bermuda Tourism Authority. So welcome to the stage, Aaron Adderley, the president of Skyport.
Thanks, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say how exciting it is to see all of these new hotel development projects taking place. Each and every one of them look phenomenal. So if you can just join me in giving them a hand for their belief in Bermuda. For sure. So I'm here to talk to you about this building that's being built just off the causeway, if you don't already know. This is an artist's rendition of the new terminal. As you can see, quite a bit of focus on lush landscaping and what have you. At the moment, we have 6 palm trees planted, so we have about 200 more to go. So let me start off by just talking a bit about Skyport and who we are. We were set up in March of 2017 upon the final execution of the project agreement between the Bermuda government and the Canadian government. And essentially it is a P3 agreement that affords a 30-year concession, which was awarded to Bermuda Skyport Corporation as the concessionaire. So we are essentially 2.5 years into the 30-year concession, so we have about 27.5 to go. And so our responsibility as the holders, if you may, of this concession is essentially to operate, develop, and maintain Bermuda's LF Wade International Airport. And the centerpiece of that entire effort is the construction and ultimate completion of the new passenger terminal building. So that's who we are. Essentially, we are the private sector concessionaire with that responsibility, i.e. delivering a project to you, the people of Bermuda, on time, on budget, and on spec. As I said, the passenger terminal that we're developing is a state-of-the-art facility, and I'm going to walk you through sort of what to expect upon opening, upon walking through that terminal building, sort of highlight a few things for you. At the moment, we are estimated to be just over 80% complete. So again, well on track to complete this project within our contractual time frame. We did experience just a slight setback after Hurricane Humberto, but I'm happy to say that we had sort of gotten ahead enough so that the delays as a result of the hurricane hasn't delayed the overall delivery date. So we are very much on time. There is a video that we would like to show right now. So the idea was to create this artistic simulation, if you may, of what the terminal building would look like. And now I'll sort of dive a bit deeper into some of those images that you just saw on that particular video. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that we've sort of focused on to ensure that your experience as a traveler going through that airport terminal building is as enhanced as much as possible. First and foremost, there are indeed boarding bridges. So long past will be the days when we are in-planing and deplaning in the elements, being subject to the elements. So we have 6 boarding bridges to ensure that everyone is protected from the elements getting on and off an aircraft. We have relied on the use of digital solutions and IT equipment to enhance our processes both on departure and on arrival. We've expanded our concessions program considerably. Certainly, when you compare it to the present-day airport, we have really focused on trying to expand your options as far as retail is concerned, as far as duty-free is concerned, as far as restaurant options are concerned, as far as lounges are concerned. So a big focus was placed on those various different elements. Custom-made solutions, if you may, to that overall customer experience. Another thing that we're focusing in on developing for the new terminal, and actually we have it rolled out on a quote-unquote soft basis at the moment, and that's our VIP concierge program, which is designed for many of you in this room and many of your clients that you might have. If you have VIPs who are arriving on island and you want them to enjoy a further enhanced experience, we are putting together a concierge program that is designed to offer the finer things in life as far as an airport is concerned. Everything from transportation to the curbside, fast track through immigration and customs, and what have you. So we're excited about that project. We've brought on some additional resources within Skyport to focus on the development of this program, and we are excited to roll it out fully come opening date. And then finally, we spent a lot of time and effort in working with our Bermudian stakeholders, specifically the Tourism Authority and the Airport Authority, in creating what we refer to as a sense of place or a sense of pride. And basically it's just a fancy term for differentiation. We're just trying to find a way to differentiate our 4 walls and a roof from any other airport with 4 walls and a roof. And the idea is to ensure that you as a resident, you as a traveler, visitors, when they walk through that airport, they feel that they are in Bermuda, or they feel as if they're leaving Bermuda. So that's what we mean by sense of place and indeed a sense of pride. Just a couple of interesting factoids about the airport. I won't bother touch on each and every one of them, but as I mentioned, 6 boarding bridges. We have nearly 38,000 square feet of concession and lounge spaces. And one thing I do want to focus in on is right there in the middle, 22 check-in counters and 15 kiosks. I want to highlight this because it demonstrates our commitment to ensuring that the design for the new terminal was flexible. And what I mean by that is, on opening day, we may indeed have 22 check-in counters and 15 kiosks. But a few months later, a year later, that ratio might flip over. We may have only 15 check-in counters and 22 kiosks. And the idea is to really be in a position where we can respond to the changes in the aviation industry. And we've seen a number of changes just in the recent past few years. So we anticipate further changes moving forward, again, with the use of digital solutions and IT. We've looked to expand our short-term parking, 130 plus parking bays, and we've also looked to expand parking bays for bikes. Anyone going down the airport on certain times of the year, you can see bikes parked all over the place. So we've tried to make provisions for that as well. So in the video, it basically provided that simulated fly-through, focused in on the curbside and then into departures, and then ultimately what you would expect on the arrival side. So I'll take you through what to experience once you arrive at the curbside at the airport. This is a view looking northeast, I believe, so that's Ferry Reach in the background. And then below the flag poles there is essentially the curbside to the departures area. So once you walk into departures, as you can see to your far left, your far left, you will see the check-in counters that I had mentioned. In the middle there, the kiosk stands. And then one thing I'll also mention about the kiosks, these kiosks will be applicable to any flight. So whether you're flying on an American airline or on a Canadian airline or British Airways, you'll be able to use the kiosk to get your boarding pass, to tag your bags, and so on and so forth. In the background of that image, you see folks queuing up for the security area. There's going to be a fundamental change within the security processing area that is certainly different from what you experience today. Go through the airport today, those of you who are traveling to the United States have to go through a dedicated security processing area, which is separate and apart from a smaller, more intimate security processing area, which is allocated for those of you who are traveling to Canada on either WestJet or Air Canada or British Airways. We've decided to just do away with that. And what we'll do is have one concentrated security area where all passengers go through. The benefit of that is to ensure that the experience is consistent, but also we've ensured that the security standards by which you will be screened against, you and your baggage, is also consistent. So when you go through the US, there are different standards. When you go through going to Canada or the United States, or the UK, there are different standards. In this setup, there will be similar standards essentially across the board. As you make your way through security, you will notice the introduction of one of those IT/digital solutions that I talked about. When we look at the passenger processing experience through any airport, especially an international airport, there are really two stress points, two significant stress points: security and customs and immigration. And we can all attest to that going through our airport in Bermuda. What we've done is we have sourced what's referred to as CT technology, or computer topography scanners, that allows the security scanning agents to have a more detailed, closer look of what's in your bag. So what does that mean? It essentially means that today, when you use conventional X-ray technology, you have to take all of this stuff out of your bag, your iPad, your computer, liquids and gels. That will no longer be the case using CT technology. And those of you in the room, especially the men who travel on business for a short one-night or two-night stay, you can relate to the experience that I often go through, where when I'm away, I have to pick up some products for my wife, whether it's shampoo or conditioner or facial products or whatever the case might be, and 9 times out of 10 they are larger than the allowable size. So what that means is when I check in to return home, what is normally just a small check-in bag, I now have to check that through, and then of course get to Bermuda and wait a while for that bag to come through. With this technology, that will no longer be the case, and going through security will be a heck of a lot smoother and less stressful. So once you make your way through security, you're upstairs in our departures lounge. The other benefit of the CT technology that we're using in security, it is going to enhance the throughput rate. So essentially, the idea is to get you through security as quickly as possible. It's better for you as passengers, but it's also better for us as airport operators, because that means the quicker you get through, the quicker you're upstairs and free to shop. So upstairs in the departures lounge, again, there are going to be some fundamental differences from what you're accustomed to in today's airport. And I think the most visual difference will be your ability to see what's going on outside on the airfield. You'll be able to see aircraft pull up to the gate, push back from the gate, taxi, takeoff, and landing. That's especially exciting for aviation nerds like myself, as well as kids who love to see airplanes up close and personal. So this will afford you that opportunity. In the existing terminal, of course, we have a lot of obstructed views, if you may, that doesn't exist in the new terminal. Very open, a lot of windows. If anyone is looking for a new business to open to support the airport, I would suggest you look at opening a window cleaning business, because there are tons of windows in the new terminal. So that's on the departures end. On the arrival side, when you come in through immigration, the idea, again, is to provide an open and airy feel. There's a tremendous amount of sunlight. As you can see to the top of that image, we have natural sunlight coming in. We have tall ceilings, very modern. And over to the right, you'll see some equipment. What is that? That is what we refer to as e-gates, or electronic passport readable processing gates. And basically, any of you in this room who have been to Gatwick or have been to Europe, you're quite familiar with this technology. And what that allows you is to go through the border processing process with just a passport, and seldom times never ever having to interact with an agent. So here, the machine requires you to place your passport on a scanner. The machine reads your passport, and then using facial recognition technology, it looks at your face and determines and confirms that you are indeed the person who is listed in the passport. And once the system does that recognition or completes that recognition, the green light goes off, the gates open, and you're free to go. So this will be applied to the immigration checkpoint. Again, another stressful point within that overall passenger experience when going through the airport. So you've made your way through immigration. Now you're out into baggage claim to collect your bags. And again, an open, airy feel, a lot of sunlight coming into that building. Once you make your way out of baggage claim with your bags in hand, you go out into the arrivals hall. One of the features within the arrivals area is the area that's designated for meet and greeters. Those individuals who are there to welcome you back home or to pick you up, arrange transport, whatever the case might be. At the moment, in the existing terminal, as you know, there's a very confined space where all these people are huddled together, holding up signs. That's no longer going to be the case in the new terminal. A lot more open and airy feeling to that whole entire space. Here, I just want to focus a bit on the 6 passenger bridges that I talked about. One of the questions that I received from members of the public leading up to the airport redevelopment project was, why are we moving away from an existing facility that has 8 gates to a facility that only has 6? That makes no sense. Actually, it does. Out of those 8 gates, 1 is dedicated to the cargo jet, which is essentially the aircraft that flies in and out of Bermuda 5 days a week, and that aircraft is bringing in courier goods, perishable goods, and what have you. It's essentially what the couriers use to bring in your packages. So that gate is dedicated to them. So that leaves us with 7 gates for regular commercial scheduled flights. Very seldom will you ever see a situation where each and every one of those 7 gates is occupied. Quite frankly, maybe only a handful of times during any given year. And so as far as utilization rate is concerned, our 7 gates are not utilized to the extent that we would like. We don't have the volume of flights to increase that utilization rate. So it was an easy decision to ensure that the new terminal building, in order that it stays within the financial framework that was established for it, or its affordability rate, we decided to limit the number of gates to 6. However, we have the capacity to easily extend should we get to a point, or when we get to a point, when Kevin and his team require another gate for us to be built at the new terminal. So this is a drone shot of the new terminal from what we call the air side. So you can see there in that picture, 6 boarding gates in the foreground, and essentially to to your left or to the south of the terminal building, that will be for British Airways and the Canadian carriers, Air Canada and WestJet. And to the north or toward the ferry reach end, that's where the U.S. carriers will park. What you cannot see in that image, and I wish I had a better image to show it, is that on the ends of the piers, if you may, so on the ends of the building on each side of the outer boarding gates, we have the opportunity to build on, again, if capacity warrants that in the future. And we can do so through a modular approach. So it's an affordable build on should the need come about. But also on the ends of that pier, if you may, are 2 outdoor lounges up on the second floor. And this is something that I really desperately wanted to see in the new terminal. When visitors come to the island, they want to be outside. When they're eating at restaurants, they want to be outside. And at the airport, it's no different. And so we work very closely with the security authorities, both in the United States and in the UK, to ensure that we have the necessary approvals to have this outdoor space where you can enjoy fine dining and drinking and whatever the case might be. So I'm really happy about that particular amenity in the new terminal building. So 2 minutes. Okay, let me hurry up. See, Aaron told me I had as much time as I needed. So one thing that we're focusing on is these bespoke concessions or these custom concessions that help us to achieve this sense of place, if you may. So unique product offerings, expanded product offerings that make the customer experience a lot more favorable. Here is an artist's impression of one of the duty-free shops. The retail outlet will have an expanded product line, everything from cosmetics to men and women products, or clothing products rather, alcohol and so on and so forth. And then for the food and beverage concession, which we're very excited about, we have a number of outlets that will feature Bermudian dishes that will be featured here on the menus. And so, again, it goes back to this whole sense of place, and we've tried to accomplish this sense of place from an holistic standpoint by focusing in on your 5 senses. So what you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you touch, and what you hear. And this is just a quick image of how we'll be using some of the Bermudian photography. These are not the actual images, but it just gives you an idea of some of the placement options that we have here at the check-in area. And the idea was not to focus solely on Bermuda landscape images, but to show our people. And, you know, we have beautiful people, so that ensures that we're not only able to establish a sense of place, but in this case, a sense of pride. Finally, I just want to talk real quickly about what we refer to as the ORET program, which is Operational Readiness and Airport Transfer. Basically a long way of saying a plan that we put in place to ensure that when it comes time to transfer from the old terminal to the new terminal, which will happen overnight, we have a robust plan in place to ensure that that is successful. It's a 7-step program. We're right now in the second phase where we are engaged in core process meetings rather, with our stakeholders. And this is just a drone image that we took of all of those stakeholders, showing the word ORET there on the ramp. This is an example of all the agencies at the airport that are actively involved in ensuring that when we make that transition, it is successful at the end of the day. And then finally, if we look at this timeline, again, we are on target to deliver this project on schedule. We're very happy about that. We haven't publicized an exact opening date. We will toward the end of the year, certainly by early next year, but you can rest assured that it will be sometime during the summer of next year, as that timeline illustrates. And then once we open, we need to ensure that from an ORET standpoint, from a planning standpoint, we have resources on hand to provide the necessary support for all the new equipment that we have in this new terminal building. So with that, thank you, and look forward to seeing you at the new LFA International Airport.
Thank you, Aaron, and apologies, we're just trying to keep on schedule for our next break. Let me introduce our next speakers, Brad DeFiore and Oliver Lamb from Alevan Pacific, or otherwise known as APAC. and they're going to walk us through air service development strategy.
Thank you. All right, let's see. Are these? Is this on? All right. Can everybody hear me? All right. I think I can hear myself, so that's good. Well, thank you. We're excited to be here. We've been consultants in air service development for a number of years. Our firm has existed. I think we're at our 10-year anniversary from the original firm. There's two firms that merged together. You'll notice in a few minutes that Ollie's Australian. So we had an Australian firm and a U.S. firm that merged about 2014, and we've been working with airports all over the world since then. So we're really excited to be here and to work with you all here in Bermuda. This presentation is going to be an overview of the market as it is. We're not going to be talking about forward-looking strategy because that's not fully developed yet. We're still working with all of our stakeholders here on developing that. But we'll talk a little bit about what we've seen, give you a little bit of insight into how this market operates, especially in the eyes of the airlines. So hopefully you'll find that interesting. So first of all, what is air service development? Well, air service development is basically business development. In most communities, the airport is one of the most, if not the most important economic driver. Certainly Bermuda, without the airport, your economy wouldn't be much. And so the airport is really, really critical in terms of everything that happens in most communities. So there was a time up until about 20 years ago where it was on autopilot. Airports were operators. They just were landlords. Airplanes would fly in. Nobody was really trying to develop business for airports. And that changed round about the time deregulation happened in the US. And since then, it's become very, very competitive. It's a global business. Aircraft are mobile assets. And so every airport in the world is in some way, shape, or form competitive with lots of other airports in the world and lots of other communities in the world. You're never isolated. In the hotel business, you build a hotel, it's there, you can't move it. In the airline business, you fly a route, it doesn't work, you can move it. And so you always need to be thinking about the fact that nothing is permanent in the airline business. And so what we do is we provide some professional attention to that. The thing about air service development is that the skill set required to understand it is very specialized. It's not taught in universities for the most part, a few specialized aviation schools maybe. But for the most part, it is learned at airlines. It's the people who work in the network planning and revenue management departments at airlines. They learn how to do this, and it's sort of an organic learning process. But in order to speak the language, you have to know the language, and so that's one of the things that we really try to help communities with. So effective air service development has many different components. Market knowledge is critical. Data expertise is really the sort of the unique thing because the airline data sources are very different than sort of other industry data or other industries. Some of it's government data, some of it's private sector data. It's rarely ever complete. Rarely ever do we have perfect information. There's lots of sample sizes and lots of trying to figure out things in new ways because so much of the industry is international and you're dealing with different government bodies with different regulatory requirements in terms of data reporting and such. Industry relationships are one of the best ways, just knowing the people who are in the industry. So for us, knowing the people who work at the airlines is critical to understanding how a service is performing. Marketing expertise. So, once we know what's going on and once we have a strategy, you still have to sell that idea to an airline. And so it's still marketing, and that's one of the reasons that in the case of Bermuda, BTA is important because destination marketing organizations are marketing organizations. And so they have a pretty good sense of what works. And so we take that sort of from a B2C to a B2B. So we do marketing with the airlines. We try to market to the airlines, the destination. And of course, the final piece here is the resources. And in some cases, resources aren't as important other than sort of just doing this basic work. And in some cases, it requires a destination to actually take some risk in terms of attracting that service or retaining that service. Here in Bermuda, the air service development team is probably pretty familiar. You've now met us. So we're the final partner, I think, in this team. But it's really a group of organizations that each have their own role to play in this. And so moving forward, we'll be working to synthesize the strategy and to help develop the message to the airlines. The first thing I want to say is that airports are the first responders in this. Airports are the entities that are on the ground dealing with the airlines every single day. They're also the entity that's expected to come to the table first in terms of offering financial incentives to attract or retain service. And usually that's in the form of rent waivers, landing fee waivers. Sometimes it's capital investment in terms of facilities. Regardless, they are usually the first group that the airlines will have their hands out to, looking for help. Government support is also critical. Some of that comes from infrastructure and policy and regulation. Sometimes governments get involved more directly in terms of mitigating financial risk. That's not terribly common. I mean, it happens a lot, but it's not the majority of routes that does not happen in. And like I was just saying, destination marketing organizations have become more and more critical, particularly in markets where air travel is significantly supported by the visitor industry. So the bigger the market, the less important this is, unless it's a place like Orlando or Las Vegas, where most of the economy is the visitor industry. Like I said, DMOs, they're built to sell the market, and they do that better than airports, so that's why the partnership is pretty good, because airports are operators generally. They're not necessarily the best at marketing, DMOs are much better at marketing, so you combine those two things and you're in a pretty good situation.
Thanks, Brad. So apologies for my accent. I know it's a little bit different from everyone you've heard today. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what the million-dollar question is, which is, how do you bring an air service in and what does it cost? So the first thing to remember is that these days there are very few risk-free new routes that exist. Airlines are not looking at a list of 100 new routes and goes, gee, I wish I had 100 planes to operate them all. Any low-hanging fruit typically has already been picked. So the next set of opportunities that airlines are looking at usually involve a lot of risk. And so what the airlines are looking to destinations and to governments and to airport authorities to do is to share in that risk. Not necessarily subsidize, but share in the risk. And the question is, what do we as a destination bring to the table when it comes to sharing in the risk? And how do we translate that into a language the airlines can understand? So traditionally, airlines have said, when we fly into a new destination, it's our aircraft. If it's empty, we wear the cost of that. If we lose all the money, we lose all the money. What they're now saying is, help us out, at least in the first couple of years, to offset that risk. And communities are coming to the table for them. And whether we as a community in Bermuda say we don't want to do that or not, the reality is the rest of the world is doing that. So if we're the ones that say we're not going to do it, we're swimming up against the stream. But I think a lot of people have quite a divergent set of views on what risk sharing actually means. They instantly think MRGs or subsidies. And the reality is that risk sharing is a toolkit. It can vary from everything from marketing incentives or marketing support, which is what the BTA does extremely well. It means going into markets and an airline says, hey, we're going to launch a new route. We need your support, BTA, to promote Bermuda in that market. And that's an important part of the risk-sharing approach because it means the airline has a partner to say, hey, you know how to sell Bermuda in this market. Partner with us and help us sell it well. Sometimes it can be an upfront cash payment, which is becoming less and less common because it's a pretty blunt tool. Sometimes it can be a revenue guarantee, so a destination will say, we will guarantee that you'll receive this amount of revenue in the first couple of years, and if you don't, we'll top it up. Sometimes it can be a profit guarantee to say that the cost of operating might vary, whether that might be fuel prices or landing at the airport. We'll make sure that you reach a certain profit level. And sometimes it can be something even more complex than that, which is, for you who work in hotels, you'll understand this, which is buying a block of seats on board a plane and say, we will guarantee that this block of seats will always be sold. So there's a whole range of things that you can do as a destination to engage in risk sharing. Not all of them involve handing money over to an airline. In fact, most of them don't. And it's important to remember that just because we might have done some things in the past doesn't mean that's the only options going forward in terms of how we bring new airlines and destinations into this market. It's about working out which tools work best for which opportunity. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Brad, and he can talk about the US market.
So We're going to talk mostly here about overall capacity and a little bit about the U.S. market primarily before I hand it back over to Ollie. So air capacity is off 20% in the last decade. In 2017 and 18, we were sort of back up at a pretty high level, and we've seen a reduction in the last year, primarily related to Americans' pullback of capacity at JFK and a little bit of pullback from JetBlue as well. To give you a sense of how that settles out versus just general growth trends, the top dark blue dotted line there, that is the overall U.S. domestic market growth rate since 2010. The light green line is the U.S. Caribbean. Or, sorry, I'm sorry, the other way, I'm sorry. The top line is the U.S. Caribbean. The light green line is the U.S. domestic market. And then the light blue line at the bottom, that's the U.S. to Bermuda market. And you can see that up and through 2015, they were just going in opposite directions. And then the last couple of years, 2015 through 2017, the growth rate had picked up, sort of starting to catch up, and that was leveled off and trailing back down again. So that's the environment that we're living in at the moment, compared to probably the two most important comparison points. One, which is the U.S. domestic market, which gives you a sense of how U.S. carriers are growing in the first place. And since U.S. carriers provide most of the capacity here, that's relevant. And then Bermuda, as most of you know and you've seen from other presentations, is generally considered in the Caribbean market set as airlines look at it. So whether you agree with that or not, the airlines look at it that way. So when they're comparing you to other markets, they're comparing you in the Caribbean market set. So when they're looking at opportunities, that's who you're being judged against. And that's really important, particularly in the off-peak period, as you can probably imagine. And so this is a look at the seasonality. And you can see the orange line is the total number of seats that are available on a daily basis into the market. And then the blue bars are the total number of passengers in those months. The dark blue are people originating here. So it's if you guys are all traveling out, that's you. You're the dark blue at the bottom, and then the light blue is the visitor market. And you can see that in the winter, residents make up about half of the traffic. And the resident line, that doesn't vary quite as much. Residents still do travel more in the peak period, but you can see the seasonality is very, very, very pronounced. Much, much bigger market into the peak summer season and falls off pretty dramatically, especially as you get into deep winter. But the interesting thing is that airfares stay relatively consistent year-round. There's a couple reasons for that, probably. One of which is it's a relatively inelastic market. Market doesn't really seem to respond to fare changes that much. So if you drop fares, you don't see a lot of additional growth in Bermuda. There's not a bunch of people just waiting for airfares to drop before they buy a ticket. We've seen very little evidence of that. But as they increase capacity, that sort of keeps prices level in the summer. So capacity increases with demand in the summer. Therefore, your overall prices sort of stay consistent year-round, which, certain times of the year, those prices might be relatively low, in a sense, but other times of the year, they're relatively high based on how much demand there is. The airlines are doing a pretty good job of matching capacity with demand in order to keep fares that constant. That's their goal, is they don't want rapid fluctuations in fares from month to month. As will probably surprise nobody, most of your demand is really heavily correlated to where you have nonstop flights, and in particular, New York and Boston. Toronto is the third largest O&D market, origin and destination market. That means that just people traveling between those two cities. It's not any connecting passengers at all. So in the state of New York and the state of Massachusetts, you have over 100 people a day that are traveling between them. And I'll show you another slide with more detail on a city basis. But you can see that the markets that are in the red circle, those are the national tourism focus cities. The ones that are green are the nurture cities, and then the ones with the red stars are markets where we have summer nonstop flights. And you can see it's highly correlated. There's a few opportunities out there to the west where there aren't nonstop flights. Those are nurture markets. Based on the data we've seen, they're going to need to be nurtured quite a bit before they'll be capable of supporting nonstop service. But that certainly should be a long-term goal. Most of this demand, like I said, it is right up and down the East Coast. Some of these are just pure O&D markets, meaning people aren't doing a lot of connecting. But some of these markets, like Atlanta is a great example of a market that has daily service and has for years. That's not a particularly large O&D market. That means most of the people on the Atlanta flights are connecting to and from other places. Now what's interesting is if you look at it per city basis, and you probably can't read these airport codes, and I probably could quiz y'all and see if you know which ones are which, but the top 15 cities, 80% of your demand is focused in the top 15 cities. West of Chicago, you only have 57 passengers a day of demand. So it is really Northeast focused, East Coast focused, but particularly Northeast focused. To give you a sense with what this number is, for JFK, that's the biggest market, 289 O&D passengers a day. Next biggest is Boston at 160, and then Toronto is at 96. To give you a sense of how big that is, a A320 has about 160 seats on it. And that's the most common aircraft type here, I think, or A319, A320. That's about the capacity of the Boston line. So you have one plane's worth of passengers to Boston every day. So every market that's smaller, which is all the rest of them, you don't have a full airplane today. So in order to have a full airplane, you would need to either do increased connecting traffic or stimulate demand in the local market to fill the airplanes. And if we look at what airlines are looking at when they look at capacity decisions, you see something pretty interesting. Except for in a couple of months, even in the peak summer season, Bermuda still has empty seats. Relative to the US market in general, there's about a 12 load factor point difference between the two markets. So there's, whereas in the domestic market, flights are operating between 80 and 90% full most of the time. In the Bermuda market, it's sort of all up and down, but at the peak, you're getting close to 90 in August, but the rest of the year, it's lower. And you might ask, well, why is that even at peak summer season? Because they've added a lot of seats, so there's a lot of capacity growth. So what's happening is, they're staying relatively consistent, sometimes being below the US average, but even as they've added seats, they've sort of added them at the pace that demand's growing, so the gap doesn't really change that much except for in April and August. Now, compared to the competitive set, this is the Caribbean markets here. It was actually 14 points lower. And what you see there is the direct correlation of the seasonality. So if you see in January is actually a peak time for the Caribbean. So they're at 82% in January, and Bermuda's at 54%. So remember, airlines are looking at this when they're making capacity decisions. So that's why you see such a cutback in the winter, because they can't fill the seats as much, and they also, remember what I said about fares being kind of flat. Even when they lower the fares, they can't stimulate more demand in the winter. So that's one of the challenges that we've got to face in the off-peak season is how do we increase demand so that they can fill more seats so that we can eventually get on the path of growing capacity. But even in the summer, there's still that gap, and so there's still some empty seats that we need to fill, and that's going to be a demand generation question primarily. This is just another look at the primary competitors, and I know this is going to be available. You'll be able to see this a little bit later when you look at it more closely, but this is just basically all the Caribbean markets. And for the most part, the light blue bar is Bermuda, and the lines are all the other Caribbean markets. And you can see how they're far more stable until you get to September. And the good news is September is terrible for everybody. So there's not there's not much of a gap there. But there's definitely some opportunity to flatten out those seasons. And this is another look at that. And what you really see here, the seasonality versus the competitive set, is that deep winter, December through March, we hit this lull. And if we can build some demand, there's an opportunity. That's an easy time for airlines to allocate aircraft. It's generally, the summer's the peak season for most airlines. So there's opportunity if there's demand. And so that's one area that we want to focus on moving forward, is how to create the demand in the off-peak season in order to stimulate traffic, in order to eventually, hopefully, get more seats to bring in even more people.
So you get my accent again for the international markets. Well, international, America's international too. But I get to do Europe because clearly Australia is part of Europe. So let's have a look at Europe for a second. I think one thing that's really interesting is we see a very similar pattern in Europe. We see this peak which comes in April and stays plateauing all the way through to October. The nice thing about Europe is the peak lasts longer. Clearly it gets cold in Europe and they don't want to go back to their weather back there. So we're seeing a flatter peak in Europe, which is a positive thing for the airlines. Nonetheless, you can see from the demand side of things that we still have that high seasonality in the months of June, July and August. And that's something that British Airways in particular has struggled with, which is to say, how do they as an airline respond to a market which is highly seasonal like this? And you can see there in particular, they're seeing months where, 3/4 of the demand nearly is being generated by point of sale Europe as opposed to Bermuda. But probably the starkest issue that they're facing, and the reason why the $1 million question we get is, why do we have services to Gatwick and not Heathrow? Is this, which is almost all traffic today between Bermuda and Europe is going to London. It's not going beyond London. Now, we've gone and looked at this from all different angles to try and find out if there are other data sources that might contradict this. Because we've heard from many stakeholders that lots of people want to go to other places in Europe and lots of people are coming from other places in Europe to Bermuda. And that's certainly true. But it doesn't outweigh the huge amount of demand that is tied to London itself. And so from British Airways' perspective, their argument to us and to you is, if the demand is going to London, why send that to Heathrow? Because not that many people are using our connecting banks in Heathrow. Send it to Gatwick, where we don't have that many connections, and that's a better use of our limited slots in London. Now, I know in response, the community says, but it means we can't connect, which creates this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, which is if you can't connect, you're not going to connect, or you spend a couple of days in London doing business. So we're looking at all the different ways we might be able to look at alternatives, but the overwhelming evidence suggests to us that the demand from Bermuda to Europe is highly, highly, highly concentrated in London specifically. Number two there might be a question later on today about what surprises me most about Bermuda. This probably surprises nobody in the room. But number two is Ponta Delgada in the Azores, which is a surprise to me, but after learning why, I'm not surprised. But I think it's probably the only time I've seen a market anywhere in North America, or the Western Hemisphere actually, where Ponta Delgada comes up number 2.
Or 20.
Or 20, yeah, even in the top 20. So, the other thing that's really interesting is having a look at how people get to Europe today. So more than 3/4 of the market takes the non-stop flight on British Airways to get to Europe. The largest connecting point is also London. So not only are 3/4 of people literally just going from here to London and stopping, but the next largest connecting point is Gatwick itself. So people are actually using Gatwick as connecting point. And you can see there that the proportion of people that are actually taking US connecting flights, I know many of you probably have done it, is much smaller than people who are going through London. So London remains our biggest and most important gateway to Europe. But one of the other really surprising things about Bermuda compared to everywhere else is the amount of people or the proportion of traffic that sits in business and first class in Bermuda. The left-hand pie chart you see there is what Bermuda to Europe looks like from an airline's perspective. More than half of passengers are not traveling in economy class. They're traveling in business first or premium economy. Now, that might not seem strange to you, but look at the right-hand chart, which is what British Airways is used to for Europe to this part of the world. And you can see there, for them, usually, more than 2/3 of the market is sitting in the back half of the plane. So they look at Bermuda and think this is very, very, very weird. And the problem with it being very, very weird like this is that planes are configured like as if the market were 2/3 economy class. And so when they come to Bermuda and they've got a plane, they don't have any planes which are configured more than half business first and premium economy and less than half economy class. They're using planes that they're flying elsewhere in the network, which are configured more to a more or less weird market configuration. And so what you probably notice when you're flying between here and London is business and first class is full. and economy class is empty. And so the secret inside squirrel tip for all of you in the room is if you want a really good night's sleep on that flight, fly economy class because you probably get 4 seats to yourself. Don't tell British Airways I told you that. But this is a problem because we're seeing 90% load factors on British Airways first and business class and 50% load factors or even less in economy class. So every day that plane comes in, a lot of those seats remain empty. And that's fewer people that we're bringing to the islands, fewer people are staying in our hotels, and it's fewer money that's being spent on island. So we look at that as a huge opportunity of when we have 50% of economy class seats unfilled, what can we do about changing that? How can we bring people in? And one of the greatest presentations I heard today was about the new 3.5-star property, which is really well aligned with one of our biggest opportunities in Europe, which is bringing in more value customers to Bermuda. So we're now going to talk about what the airlines have told us directly, so more secret squirrel stuff.
All right, so that's just a basic data overview. Like I said, that's sort of a backwards looking, just we're doing our research to try to understand the market before we move forward with strategy development. But one of the things, probably the most important thing we did is we had a lot of conversations with stakeholders. And those stakeholders ranged from the travel agent groups, the hotel groups. We were here in August and had lots of conversations with Skyport, obviously with the government, with BTA, as well as a lot of the major associations and some of the large companies that are operating here. We had a really, really broad cross-section of people. And what was interesting is how common the issues were. And we broke this down. You'll see one side is local stakeholders, the other side is airlines. And you'll notice that there's some common themes, although maybe from the opposite perspective in some of these. Because we talked to all of the incumbent airlines as well. And so to give you a sense, on the left side, there's probably nothing there that's going to seem unfamiliar to most of you. Fares are too high, the seasonality impacts business. You need better schedule options. No one likes to get stranded in Atlanta or Philadelphia for 24 hours if you miss the flight. As Ollie was talking about, the access to Europe is a challenge, and reliability also plays back into that stranding issue, right? So those are sort of the local stakeholder issues. Does that sound about right to everybody? Kind of familiar? Yeah, I see like 3 people nodding, so I'll go with that.
Clearly the steak is hitting right now.
If it was 4 o'clock, I'd have more nodding, I'm pretty sure. So on the airline side, what we have is some of this is similar, and you'll understand maybe if you read those kind of why some of these challenges exist. It's a solid business market, like Ollie was saying. It's a very premium market. They like that. It supports high fares. It's generally a stable market. It doesn't vary a lot over time. Summers are excellent. But the 4th bullet point is interesting, particularly in relationship to the 1st bullet point. Lower fares do not stimulate demand. They just reduce revenue. We've heard that from a number of carriers. And we're doing some work right now to sort of validate that, to see how true it is. But we've heard that from a number of carriers. When they lower fares, they don't see a spike in demand. They probably see a little bit of demand increase, but not enough necessarily to offset how much they drop the fare by. So they're filling the airplanes a little bit more, but they're not necessarily, and in fact, what they claim is in most cases, they're actually getting less revenue. So that's an issue, and that's a demand problem, basically. Winter is very difficult, no surprise there. High operating costs. It's an expensive destination for airlines to operate in, and that contributes to the high fares. So that's a challenge for the whole destination. We're not just talking about airport costs. We're talking about every aspect of the trip. And so that affects the demand for, if somebody's sitting in Canada and wants to make a trip someplace and Bermuda's in the decision set, the airfare is a significant part of that, but the total cost of the trip is a significant part of it as well. And so you're being judged against other markets that might have a lower overall cost. And that's not new to any of you, I'm sure, but that does come into, and the airlines understand this. Because you do tend to underperform the Caribbean markets, you don't get a lot of attention in terms of potential capacity additions and such. And so that's one thing that we'll look to address moving forward. The lack of mass appeal kind of plays into the high operating costs. I've already mentioned the destination cost impacts visitor demand. So basically, is there anything in there that sounded crazy to anybody? I mean, you don't have to act, just raise your hand if you got anything.
You can always tell us later.
Yeah, we're going to do a Q&A. I just want to make sure that we're like kind of in the right board. All right, so that is actually the last part of this presentation. I think we do all right, we'll stay right here.
Okay, while we're doing this, I have a pop quiz. See who can answer the question. What's our third biggest market in Europe? It was up on that chart. Who looked at it? Well done. You are awake. Congratulations. It's Dublin.
Thank you. All our other panel members to come up now.
Where shall I sit?
It's right here.
Thank you, sir.
Go. You want to move them all down?
I think it's all right.
Yeah, anyway.
It's cozy.
Thank you, Alistair.
Lots of
you,
blue
that's
jackets.
pretty good.
We need Ken in the middle and break up the blue jacket.
Aaron did really well too. In fact,
All right, thank
I've got
you,
this to make your
gentlemen,
life
and you are all
difficult.
gentlemen.
Yeah, we failed the panel diversity test, don't we?
Can I ask, for those of you that haven't spoken yet, to introduce yourselves? Maybe Lester, start with you.
Hi, I'm Lester Nelson, the CEO of the Bermuda Airport Authority.
Everyone knows Kevin. He has no choice to be here, but thank you for being here.
Anytime.
I'm Ken Hassard, Commercial Director for Skyport.
Thank you all for being here. So let's jump right into the questions. Kevin, what role does the BTA play specifically in air service development?
Well, so I think Ollie and Brad address that to some extent. Our role is to generate demand in one of the pillars that supports air service to Bermuda, which is obviously tourism. Our job is also to help tell Bermuda's story. So we play a role in marketing the island, not only to visitors, but also to businesses. That includes airlines. I think one of the things that we recognized was that the birth of Skyport and the Airport Authority created a huge number of positives from our point of view, but it also meant there are more stakeholders at the table. And I think that's one of the reasons that we thought it was really important to get at least one Australian and some air service development folks around the table to actually help align everybody on, are we all pulling in the same direction, and what's our shared strategy? And of course that includes the government of Bermuda as well.
Great. And Lester, what is the Airport Authority, and what does it do, and how is it different than the Civil Aviation Authority?
Well, what it does, it keeps the airport functioning, because without us, there will be no air service. Aaron mentioned earlier that the airport operates under a public-private partnership. We are that public authority that has the relationship with Skyport. So we are 50 professionals. We have a $16 million budget. We provide services such as air traffic control, Bermuda Weather Services, the wonderful job that they did last month during the hurricane, and certainly daily.
So it's you that we call when the radar is down.
That's right, and the radar is back up. We apologize for that. It was down for about 3 days, right? It's back up. That's another story. We're talking about air service, not radars, right? But in terms of the operations of the airport, Skyport operates the wonderful new terminal, the existing terminal, and the new terminal that's coming online. We operate the air navigation services. Brad and Ollie spoke about the risk sharing and air service. We also are a risk sharing partner in that venture as well.
All right, thank you. And Ollie, I'm going to ask you, you cannot use the answer that you gave earlier about the Azores. But what is the most interesting thing that you've learned while you've been working with Bermuda?
Ooh, that's really tricky. That people don't want to come to Bermuda when the average temperature is 70 degrees. No, I can't understand that, to be honest with you. I think 70 degrees sounds fantastic, so I can't understand that. No. Probably I think one of the strangest things for us is this imbalance between business and first class and economy class. it's meant that the rules of airline economics in Bermuda are a little bit strange. It's like the Bermuda Triangle of airline economics, if I can call it that, which is everything's sort of been turned upside down. So they can operate with much emptier planes than they normally would, as you saw from Brad's slides, and yet still survive in the market. And they can do that because they're filling up the front end of the cabin with business travelers. And I guess probably one of our questions in the long run will be, how do we take advantage of that? So the empty seats that creates, as well as what challenges does that create for the market? And so we'll be looking at that and trying to work out what are we going to do with all those empty economy class seats and how can we use them to the greatest advantage of Bermuda.
And Brad, I'll throw it over to you now. Have you worked with any other destinations that you would say have had similar challenges to Bermuda, and what did you see them do about it?
Yeah, so I've worked with Hawaii for about a decade, and it's obviously a much bigger market, but it has a lot of similar challenges. Just the DNA is so similar. It's not a drive market. Very, very dependent on the tourism sector, and lots of stakeholders and lots of issues, I think, in the market in terms of what the industry means to the residents and what it means to the government, and how you balance the needs of residents and the needs of the industry that employs the residents. And so there's some similarities there. And then we work with quite a few, I would call burgeoning destinations, smaller destinations that are just sort of now in this global travel boom hitting their peak. And places like Savannah Hilton Head and Palm Springs and Asheville, those are three of our clients that I think we're at a stage of their development. They were pretty small destinations, especially from an air perspective. They were mostly drive markets. And even though they're not islands, they were basically an island in their region. And what we've seen is that you can induce demand by creating great product. These places have existed for years. They became popular not just because of what they had, but because they purposefully and intently made a better product. They developed hotels. They developed new hotels that attracted people. They new restaurants and the programming that was talked about earlier. They created a product that people wanted to come in. One thing that happened in a lot of those places is they really impacted their seasonality. They were all of them they had very, very strong peaks. Maybe not as strong as Bermuda, but they've all been able to balance those peaks a bit with having the air service exists, and as you know, there's lots of seats here in the off-peak that are empty still. But by creating experiences and creating reasons for people to come that weren't specifically the things that they usually came for. In Palm Springs, people come, to get out of the cold. But Palm Springs isn't always super hot. And so there were things that are done in the off-peak season to attract people to come then. And I think that's one of the lessons I think that we can take for Bermuda is that there's inventory available both at the hotels and with the airlines. How do we create that demand? And that's tricky, but I think that's related to some of the other things that we've done.
Okay. And you mentioned in Hawaii their need to balance between resident needs and visitors. Aaron, you've mentioned in previous forums how important it is that all 3 cylinders of air travel be firing at once, so business travel, resident travel, and leisure travel. What is it important for us to think about as we develop a strategy around those 3?
Well, I think one of the slides that Brad had up showed the disparity between residents traveling during the winter and the amount of seat capacity that they account for during that time of year versus summer. And in order for our air service development efforts to be a little easier, in order for our flights to be more sustainable, we need all 3 of those market segments to be firing on all cylinders. Roughly speaking, visitors, residents, you and I in this room, and business travelers account for roughly 33% each of the market. So 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And because we are a low-volume destination in terms of the number of leisure visitors that we have coming to the island, we need each one of those three markets to be strong and healthy. When we talk about the substantive drop-off that we have during the shoulder seasons leading into the peak seasons, it's those business travelers, it's you and I in this room, and it's visitors that will enable us to expand the peak season and strengthen those shoulder months. And that helps us tremendously when we sit down and talk with airlines, because we're no longer in a situation where the day after Labor Day there has to be this significant drop-off in seat capacity. Now, with all three markets performing at full strength, we have the demand to sustain that capacity over a longer period of time. So that's why that's so critical.
So y'all need to travel more.
Yeah.
Ken, in your opinion, what is it about having a new airport? What does that mean to air service development?
Well, it depends. It depends where the new airport is and why it's being built. So if it's a large capacity constrained hub in the Middle East, for example, new capacity may be coming online to address demand that's growing faster than the destination can provide. In the case of Bermuda, that's not the case. The new terminal we have was built, it was conceived and is being built to replace an old terminal that outlived its useful life. But there's two things that are good about this project. One is how it was structured in terms of financing. It's actually being financed by private investors who have a need for return on investment for some reason. And that seems to come from offering higher levels of service and a focus on air service development. It's really traffic growth that drives return on investment for investors in airports. And the second good thing is that this project happened at a time where it actually became part of a buzz package. And when I say a buzz package, what I mean is I'm referring to two things that impact airline decisions. One is data and good business cases based on analysis of actual or predicted future demand. And the other is buzz, because airlines are always looking at opportunities, and there's hundreds of places where they can fly. But all of a sudden they hear that something's going on somewhere. And when we first started talking to airlines in 2015, actually most of the younger planners we talked to didn't know for sure where Bermuda was. Like Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, it was a bee island. By the time we were talking to the same planners and others in 2016, they'd heard about planning for America's Cup. And we were at meetings with Aaron, with ministers from the government of Bermuda, and we were also telling the story of plans for new hotels, like St. Regis and at the time Morgan's Point, plans to have casino gaming, new airports. So we had a buzz story to tell. And what the airlines saw from 2016 to 2018 was 20% growth in traffic to Bermuda. It was actually a higher rate of growth than either the US domestic market or the Caribbean market. And that's where we're at now. And part of the reason we're here is because of this package that includes the new airport.
Right. Aaron, if I could go back to you and ask about the UK and European market. We heard a little bit in the numbers from Brad and Ollie. But in your view, how could Bermuda look to expand air service or demand from that part of the world? Is it even still worthwhile based on what we heard?
I do think it's worthwhile. It's challenging, but it is worthwhile. There are a few things that are happening locally that I think strengthens our ability to secure an option to the UK and Europe. And again, this is another slide that Brad and Ali had highlighted in their presentation. And that was the introduction of this affordable price point room inventory, i.e. the Bermudiana property. It's one of the reasons why, and I know JP is in the audience, one of the reasons why Grotto Bay is so successful And it does very well with Canadians, but also with those passengers coming off the British Airways flight. And it never ceases to amaze me when those flights arrive. We follow those passengers. We're not stalking them, but we just
That's a little creepy.
It's so impressive to see how many of them go straight to Grotto Bay. And the reason why that is so telling, because it underscores the importance of having these affordable price points. And especially when you talk about the UK European market, the whole aspect of all-inclusive products sort of comes to mind. So anytime that we've sat down with an airline and talked about the viability of introducing a Bermuda service, the conversation has always shifted toward what type of room inventory is available. And so seeing the hotel developments that we have on island is one of the reasons why I'm really enthusiastic about what's going on from a hotel development standpoint. And also when we talk about Europe, when we talk about the UK, in the United States, the market is quite clear. You have legacy carriers, you have low-cost carriers. In the UK and Europe, you have these sort of leisure carriers, the Thomas Cooks and the TUIs sort of come to mind, and they're very popular in the UK. Not popular enough to keep Thomas Cook out of bankruptcy, but they're still very popular. And, you know, I would venture to say, or I would offer to say that, you know, Ken, who's been working very hard on air services developments over the past few years, you know, really had some promising conversations with one of these operators. And at the end of the day, the timing just didn't work out. We weren't able to bring it to fruition. But the fact that we have with the Bermudiana property coming online, with properties like Grotto Bay, even with properties like this, Fairmont, the idea of having those affordable price points is really attractive to UK carriers. And I think ultimately we will eventually secure an alternative service to the UK. The other thing that gives me hope is that, you know, there's a direct positive correlation, as everybody in this room knows, between capacity and demand. The more capacity you put on, the more demand that is stimulated, 9 times out of 10. And if any of you in the room can remember, a number of years ago, we had Zoom Airlines. Does anybody remember that? Zoom operated for 1 year, and I guess they weren't successful enough to stay out of bankruptcy as well. But the point that I would make with Zoom is that for that one summer that they were operating, and they were filling those planes, when we looked at the year-over-year difference in traffic for British Airways, there was a difference of 1 passenger. So what does that tell us? Every single person that Zoom brought to this island was stimulated traffic. There was no cannibalization that was taking place. So that underscores for me the idea that if we can successfully secure an alternative service to the UK, the demand will be stimulated.
Kevin, I'm going to give you a chance to comment on a perception that I think a lot of people have, which is that we don't have competition to British Airways because they have a protected monopoly. Is that true?
That's one I've heard every couple of weeks for the last 3 years, and I think poor Aaron's heard every couple of weeks for the last 20 years. Short answer is no. The only thing that protects BA's position in the market is the way they operate it, which is, as Brad and Ollie showed you, they fill the front of the plane and fly the back largely empty, which means that any other airline looking at that route simply doesn't see the demand that would justify the extra capacity. And so you could argue that that's actually strategic by British Airways. I'm not sure I think they're that clever, to be perfectly honest, but that market behavior is what keeps other carriers out of the market rather than any sort of secret deal with government or arrangement with us. There is no deal with BA that gives them a privileged position. They're just the only folks today who want to run service.
So Ken, how important is it to have competition on a route?
Well, I think everybody, generally high level thinks that competition is a good thing. I go sort of back to sort of the real fundamentals that in looking for routes, it's always better to have one carrier than 0 carriers. And it's really a question, once you have a carrier on a route, when it's advantageous to have competition and when it's not. And Kevin actually made a good point, because what British Airways does is a defensive strategy that's used, and not just by British. I think it's important to point out that 6 of the 10 routes that Bermuda has are monopoly routes. We've got Miami, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Charlotte, Washington, and London, and even in the summer if you want to count Newark, but it's kind of in New York. But
Try
and
telling someone in New Jersey that.
all of the carriers on those routes are legacy carriers, so they take advantage of the monopoly position. And on top of that, they understand that, you know, Bermuda's a high-end destination. So rich Bermudians that travel a lot and rich visitors that can afford to come here shouldn't mind paying extra on a monopoly route. Yeah.
All right, I've got one last question, and I will let Kevin and Lester both answer.
Ooh.
What are you hoping to achieve out of an agreed air service development strategy at the end of this?
Go for it, Lester.
Well, I mean, just for starters, I would like for the Skyport and the Airport Authority and BTA to be more joined up, and we are, with the assistance of APAC. And as they mentioned earlier, air service development is very complicated. There are no, you know, other than the low-hanging fruit, there's no easy answers. The resources are limited, and the financial resources are limited. So what this looks like for me over the next 5 years is that we have that sustainable air service that we're not subsidizing or supporting financially in any way.
Kevin?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, given everything that we know, I would support it, what Lester said about having everybody aligned and pulling in the right direction, and with a plan that's right-sized for the resources that we've got. So I think my ambition would be that we get, you know, a decent season out of Newark. I think there's a case for year-round service out of DC. You know, I think we should be looking at incrementally improving upon what we have today, rather than expecting that we're going to have, you know, 20 direct connections by 2021 instead of 10. Although that'd be nice, guys.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Do you want to do questions from the?
We have a few minutes for questions. Are there questions in the audience? Yep, okay. We've got a couple mics here.
Let's get the break.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Diane Carlson, and I worked as a senior manager with tourism in North America for 14 years. And I'm very proud of where it is today, and I thank all of those who are involved in the operation on our behalf. I've got a couple of questions I'm going to throw out to you. One is the seasonality chart that I saw today. Bothered me a little bit, and I'm sure there's a good reason why it is the way it is. However, we've shrunk our high season on that seasonality chart. That bothers me. I know one thing about selling is you use words that paint pictures as much as possible and paint those positive pictures. Shrinking the seasonality of our high season, I don't know if that's the wisest thing that we've done. High season was always April to November. And I see now we have winter, and we have spring, and then we have the summer and the winter. I've always said Bermuda actually has 2 seasons. It has summer, and our winters are spring. And when you say spring, the faces of the people you're talking to light up. They can picture what Bermuda is like, temperature-wise, weather-wise. Winter is a pretty negative picture, and they can only picture it based on their experience. So I just throw that out to you. On the airline side, we certainly did subsidize. Years ago, I was there when we started subsidizing the airlines to Bermuda. It did work to a large degree. It kept us with airlift. But what it bothered me was very little in return was coming from the airlines. They would accept the subsidies. And, you know, they would fly, of course. But very little marketing, very little support of tourism. In those days, all the airline negotiations went under the tourism umbrella. I wondered if that's improved at all today, or is that even expected today? Last but not least, the terminal. It's gorgeous, and congratulations on a job well done in such a short time. I drove by there recently, and it took my breath away. But I also said to myself, my God, we're such a small island. How did we end up with such a huge terminal? Especially with it being 2 stories as well. So I leave you with that. Thank you.
Right.
There wasn't a question there, we're good.
I think there were 3 questions.
I can address the second question. So airlines still don't do a lot of marketing in market. Airlines aren't well equipped for that. They fly to, a typical U.S. legacy carrier flies to over 300 destinations. They don't have the resources to be in every market, kind of doing the groundwork. And so that's airports and tourism agencies and such. Those are the organizations that have taken over that role that nobody was doing a decade ago. And so that's really part of the risk sharing that communities take on when you do a deal like that. Now, one thing I said, you'd mentioned that you thought airlines weren't taking as much of the risk. And what I would say to you is the airlines would say they're taking all the risk. What the community or the government or whoever is subsidizing in a minimum revenue guarantee is a very, very, very small portion of the risk at the airline. So say it's a $2 million revenue guarantee. In a case of a $2 million revenue guarantee, the airline itself might have $100 million at risk. That's their contribution to it. And their argument is, and whether we all agree with this or not, they're the ones who make the decisions to fly or not. So they get to set the rules. And what their argument is that they have made that investment from day one. They might lose money in the first year. That's why they have a revenue guarantee or what other incentive to help mitigate that. But the destination is benefiting from the first time that airplane shows up and without any other risk. And so their argument is, and they have the leverage basically to make that argument that, we expect you to come to the table. We're still taking the majority of the risk. And so that's the world that we actually live in. And I agree with you that airlines could do a lot better job of being partners in some of these things. But that is, they sort of set the rules in a lot of these things now. So, they view themselves as taking on most of the risk in the first place.
I mean, I'll take the first one, which I have a particularly direct point of view about, which is I think that pretending Bermuda only has 2 seasons and one is high season and the other is shoulder season is actually how we got in a mess in the first place. So as part of looking at the National Tourism Plan, we looked at 50 years of Bermuda's tourism strategy, and they all said the same thing, and they all talked about using that strategy to end seasonality. And it doesn't work. And I think it's because it's actually not true. Bermuda does have 4 distinct seasons. And just because it might be spring or fall here doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a peak in travel demand. It just means the weather is different than it is in the summer. Anyone want to take the third one? Why is the airport so big, Aaron? It's because Canada has a lot of money.
It is. It certainly appears that way. One thing I can say, when we look at the actual footprint of the 2 buildings, the footprint is very much similar, very similar. And what we tried to do in the new terminal, and yes, we have fewer gates than the existing terminal building, but what we tried to do was to provide space in what were traditionally bottlenecked stress points. So what you will find in the new terminal is a very open design. You can literally stand at one end of the terminal and look straight down at the opposite end. Obviously, you can't do that in the existing terminal. The other thing that we did in order to provide that openness and eerie feel, which we think is very critical to enhancing the overall passenger experience, is providing that open ceiling, if you may. So when you're on the ground floor, you can look straight up to the ceiling. When you're on the second floor, which is pretty much an atrium, you can look down on the first floor. So it was all designed to create a better overall experience. And at the end of the day, even though it doesn't necessarily appear that way, the footprints are very similar between the two buildings. Nice to see you, Diane.
All three questions.
Look at that.
Do we have time for one?
Yeah.
One more question? Did anyone else have questions? Sorry, it's hard to see out there.
Good afternoon. My name is Marlene Bicchietti. I'm a real estate agent specializing in fractional ownership. So I agree with you, Kevin. I'd love to see the DC flight year-round.
Got that?
This summer, I've been asking for that for 5 years. We've seen a lot of guests this summer from DC, many of them young millennials who were here as guests of their parents who were from New England, bringing them here, never knew we were here. My question specifically is, what can you do to bring flights from Westchester County Airport?
We had that conversation with JetBlue many years ago.
Yes, I had that conversation with JetBlue for 40 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure they enjoyed that.
You know, the message we get from JetBlue is let's focus on our existing services and ensure that they're sustainable before we turn our attention to new services. But one point of encouragement that I will offer you with regards to the DC flight, I can tell you that American was very pleased with the performance out of DC this year. And I will say that for a couple of airlines, the grounding of the 737 MAX has adversely impacted their ability to expand services as quickly as they would like. So we would like to think that Bermuda is part of that expansion plan, but the grounding of that aircraft has sort of tied their hands a bit. But it is encouraging that DC did perform very well this past year. It's encouraging that the airline decided to bring back Philadelphia year-round, albeit on a reduced frequency during the quote-unquote winter period. And you know, I'll also mention United. United were very pleased with the results of the Newark service. The reduction in that frequency was very frustrating for me because I always felt that Newark was extremely successful because when I talk about those three key market segments, visitors, business travelers, and residents alike, United was the one airline that was able to appease each and every one of those market segments. The Newark service performed extremely well. But I think, you know, again, they had some capacity issues, but they are feeling good about Bermuda, and we hope one thing about the airlines, I'll end on this, they're very slow to react. And so if they see positive results this year, oftentimes they're not in a position to react until the following year. But we've received a lot of encouragement from some key players.
If I could elaborate, there's one thing that I think everybody should kind of think about when you think about how airlines make these decisions, is airlines are a network business. So, and with the exception of New York, if you remember the one slide where I showed you there's over 300 passengers a day in New York and then everyone else is lower, a lot of passengers that are on flights to any of these cities are actually connecting beyond. So when you adjust capacity in one market, you also affect the demand in another market. So if you added, let's say, a new Washington service, that inevitably is going to take some passengers off some other flights. And so airlines, when they make these decisions, they don't make it in a vacuum of, oh, we should just add Washington. They're evaluating across their portfolio and seeing how that will impact them. So it gets really complicated. And so that's why some of the times it's pretty slow, is because they really want to make sure that they're not negatively impacting their existing services, and what they're doing is a net benefit to themselves and to the market. And so whenever you think about, you know, a new service, think about it in the context of particularly that airline, what they're also flying already, and how that might impact it. That's where demand becomes so important. Creating more demand supports more services overall.
All right. Thank you. So we're going to take a quick break.
Actually,
right now.
we're not.
Oh, okay. We're going to
There you
skip
go.
through the break. And we're going to go right to our next session, so thank you.
Yeah, if you guys can take your chairs, just those two. Nope, leave those. There we go. So I'm going to make a deal with you, which is that we're running a little behind. The last session of the day, I think, is really